Hello friends, I am P.SUJATHA, Assistant Professor, PG and Research Department of Economics, A.D.M. College for Women, Nagapattinam. In previous video, I explained about the sampling theory and their types. In this video, we will see the remaining part of sampling theory and their types. Cluster sampling. A cluster random sampling is a probability sampling technique where the population is divided into groups or clusters which are randomly selected. So instead of sampling individual from the entire population, clusters of individual are chosen and then either all individual within this cluster are surveyed or random sample from within each cluster is taken. This method is especially useful when the population is large and spread out geographically. For example, we want to take 5,000 students from Tamil Nadu. We must take university at the first stage, then the number of colleges at the second stage, selection of students at the third stage, etc. So now we explain about what is the steps in cluster random sampling. So in the same way, first you define the population, clearly define the entire population you want to study. Second, form clusters. Divide the population into clusters. The clusters should ideally be heterogeneous within but homogeneous between. Randomly select cluster, a number of cluster from the population. Sample within cluster, either survey all individual within the selected cluster or randomly sample individual from within these clusters. What are the advantages and disadvantages of cluster random sampling? The cluster random sampling is cost effective. It reduces travel and administrative cost by concentrating the sample in certain locations. Feasible for large population. Practical for large population spread across a wide area. Easily implementation. Cluster random sampling is similar to administrator. Next, what are the disadvantages of cluster random sampling? Increased sampling error. It can result in higher sampling error if cluster are not homogeneous. Potential for bias. If cluster are not representative of population, the result may be biased. Example of cluster sample. A researcher wants to study the academic performance of students in a large school district with 100 schools. Instead of sampling students from each school, the researcher could randomly select 10 schools, 10 clusters, and then either survey all the students within these 10 schools or randomly sample students within each of the selected schools. Multi-stage sampling. The multi-stage sampling is an extension of cluster sampling and it involves multiple stages of sampling. It combines various sampling methods and it used in large-scale survey. In each stage, the cluster are formed and then subsampled. Steps in multi-stage sampling. So first you define the population. Next, first stage, form cluster. Divide the population into primary cluster and randomly select the number of cluster. Third, Second stage, subdivide the cluster. Divide the selected primary cluster into secondary cluster and randomly select the number of these secondary cluster. So continuous subdivision, continue subdividing and sampling within the cluster until the final sampling units are selected. So sample within finite cluster, randomly sample individual within the finite cluster. Advantage and disadvantage of multi-stage sampling. Advantage, it's very flexible and versatile. It can be adapting to complex and large population. Cost and time efficient. So it reduces cost and time by concentrating sampling efforts in selected clusters, reducing data collection effects by focusing on smaller manageable subgroups at each stage. So disadvantage of multi-stage sampling, complexity, more complex to design and implement compared to single stage sampling methods. Second, increased sampling error. Each stage of sampling can introduce additional sampling error. So the example of multi-stage sampling, a national health survey aimed to assess the health status of the population across the country. The survey could follow these steps. First stage, select several states, the primary cluster, and the second stage, within the each selected state, randomly select countries, secondary cluster. Third stage, within each selected countries, randomly select neighborhood. Fourth stage, within each selected neighborhood, randomly select household, the final cluster. The final stage, randomly select individual within each selected household for the survey. The next, another one is non-random sampling method. The non-random sampling method, also known as a non-probability sampling method, do not provide every individual in the population with an equal chance of being selected. These methods are often used when it is impractical or impossible to conduct random sampling. Non-random sampling is useful for exploratory research, case study, or when working with a specific population. However, it may introduce bias and limit the generalizability of the finding. Judgment sampling, also known as purposive sampling, it is a non-probability sampling techniques where the researchers select unit to be sampled based on their knowledge or professional judgment. This method is used when the research believes that certain individuals or groups are particularly knowledgeable or to have specific characteristics that are important for the study. The characteristics of judgment sampling: researcher driven. The selection process is based on the researcher's specific expertise and knowledge about the population. So the researcher having high level of knowledge about the population. Specific criteria: the individual or groups are chosen because they meet specific criteria that are relevant to the research objective. Subjective: the method relies on the researcher discretion, making inheritably subjective. So what is the steps to be followed in judgment sample? Define the population. So first clearly define the population. What is the criteria for selecting sample? Identify key information. Use expert knowledge to identify individuals or groups that are likely to provide valuable information. Select the sample, choose the sample based on the predefined criteria. So what is the advantage of judgment sample? Judgment sampling is focused and relevant data. The researcher to focus on specific groups that are most relevant to the research objective. Efficiency. It can be more efficient and a cost-effective method. Flexibility. Adaptable to a wide range of research contexts and objectives. So the disadvantage of judgment sampling, this method process is subjective and can introduce research bias, which may affect the reliability and validity of the finding. A lack of generalizability. Result from judgment sampling cannot be generalized to the entire population because the sample is not randomly selected. Dependence on expertise. The quality of sample and the findings heavily depend on the researcher expertise and the knowledge. So, for example of judgment sampling, the researchers studying the impact of innovative teaching methods on students' performance might use judgment sampling to select teachers known for their innovative practice. The researcher would select teachers from various schools who have received awards or recognition for their teaching method. By focusing on these specific teachers, the researcher aims to gather detailed insights into effective teaching strategies. Next one is convenience sampling. The convenience sampling is also a non-probability sampling technique where samples are selected based on ease of access, availability, and proximity to the researcher. It involves choosing respondents who are easiest to reach or availability without randomized. This method is often used in exploratory research or when quick and cost-effective sampling is needed. Characteristics of convenient sampling: easy of access. So the samples are chosen from the population that is easy to reach. Second is speed and efficiency. This method is quick and require minimum effort and cost. Lack of randomization. The selection process is non-random, so leading to potential bias. Steps to follow the convenience sampling. First, to define the population, to identify who is the target population for the study. Select accessible subject. Choose subject who are easily accessible or available. Collect data. Gather data from the selected subject. The advantages of convenience sampling: it is very quick and easy. It requires less time and effort compared to other sampling method. It's a cost effective. Minimum resources are needed for sample selection and data collection. Useful for preliminary research. So in the convenience sampling is suitable for pilot studies, initial explorations, and hypothesis generation. Disadvantages: bias and lack of representativeness, a limited generalizability, risk of oversampling. Example of convenience sampling: researchers want to study the eating habit of college students. They might choose a survey student in the college canteen during lunchtime as it is convenient and ensure the available samples. However, the sample may not be representative of all the college students as it excludes those who do not eat at the canteen. Next, the convenient sample is a practical and efficient method for quick and low cost data collection, especially in preliminary research stage. While it offers several advantages in terms of ease and efficiency, researcher about the cautions about the limitation, particularly the potential for bias and a lack of representativeness. So while using the convenient sample, it is essential to acknowledge these limitations and interpret the finding accurately. Next, quota sampling. The quota sampling is nothing but it is also a non-probability sampling in which the population is segmented into mutually exclusive subgroups and a non-random set of participation is chosen from each subgroup to meet the predefined quota. This method aims to ensure that simple representation represents certain characteristics of the population such as age, gender, income level or education, etc. The characteristics of quota sampling is one is segmentation because the population is divided into distinct subgroups based on the specific characteristics. Quota controls, the quotas are set for each subgroups to ensure the representation of the sample. Non-random sample, the participant within each subgroup are selected non-randomly, so it's based on convenience or judgment. So it's compared to other method, it's the method it's compared to various probability sampling. The quota sampling is less effort than the probability sampling method, and it's compared with versus convenience sampling. The quota sampling provide more control over sample composition than the convenience sampling method. So the quota sampling is a practical and efficient method for ensuring that specific subgroups are represented in the sample, making it valuable in the market research and exploratory studies. However, the random sampling selection process can introduce bias and limit the generalization of the finding. The researchers should use the quota sampling when subgroups representation is critical and resources are limited, while being mindful for this limitation and potential biases. So steps to select the quota sampling: first to define the population, next to determine the quotas, to set quotas for each subgroups to ensure that they are proportionally represented in the sample, select the participation, choose participation within each subgroup using non-random methods until the quotas are met. The advantage of quota sampling to ensure subgroup representation. Next, time, cost and time efficient, more practical and less time consuming than probability sampling method. It's simple to administer, easy to implement, especially when specific subgroup proportional are known. The disadvantage of quota sampling is potential for bias, limited to generalization, dependence on accurate population data. So these are the sampling methods. Thank you.